What are some of dark events happened in history not many people know about? In my family's region in Africa, they used to carry out the death penalty by snake bite. Just a snake bite to each ankle, and then letting the man spend his remaining time with his family before he died, under supervision. I thought it sounded sort of humane in a way, like our lethal injections. But apparently they say it was one of the most horrific ways that existed. The Halifax explosion, regarded by many as the biggest man-made explosion prior to the invention of the atomic bomb. A ship laden with explosives collided with another vessel in Halifax Harbor. The resulting explosion flattened much of the city's downtown core, killing roughly 2,000 and injuring 9,000. The blast is said to have temporarily displaced the water in the harbor, forming a tsunami that reached up to 15 meters high, surging over the wreckage of the waterfront. The following day, Halifax was hit by a blizzard that dumped 40 centimeters of snow on top of the city, further complicating rescue efforts. The city is also home to a cemetery where many victims of the Titanic were laid to rest. It is said that the body identification system developed at the time of the Titanic sinking in 1912 aided efforts to identify victims of the Halifax explosion in 1917. Kakikai, or the chicken poop prison in Thailand, used by French forces to hold political prisoners, rebellious Thai people, in the Chanthaburi region. The long-standing impacts of this much-feared torture are still felt in the region today. There's a Thai saying for those who buck authority that roughly translates to be careful not to get caught in a chicken poop prison. I learned about this prison from my parents who learned about it from theirs. How it worked was there was a small, 2-story prison. Bottom floor houses the prisoners, and the top floor is basically a huge chicken cooperative. The grated floor ceiling ensures that the chicken poop falls onto the prisoners below. Apparently, even though the maximum sentence in Kakikai was around a week, it was one of the most feared punishments there was. The New London School explosion. On the afternoon of the 18th of March, 1937, the shop teacher at the school in New London, TX, turned on an electric sander. Unbeknownst to him, there was a massive natural gas leak under the school. The sander sparked, which ignited the gas and caused a massive explosion that killed almost 300 students and teachers. It was absolutely horrific. The force of the explosion was so great that a 2-ton block of concrete crushed a car parked 200 feet away. This event is actually why natural gas has a smell now. They started adding it after the explosion so that something like this couldn't ever happen again. My grandfather was actually one of the survivors of the explosion. He never talked about it, even to his own family, so I didn't really know too much about it, other than the fact that he survived until after his death. Toward the end of his life, he'd suffered a series of strokes that left him pretty physically incapacitated, so my dad had given him a voice-activated tape recorder and suggested maybe he could record his memoirs for his grandkids to listen to someday. As it turns out, he did. We have hours and hours of cassette tapes of him telling the story of his, actually very interesting, life, including a big section on the New London School explosion. For the sake of everyone's privacy, I'll call my grandfather Papa and use an initial for anyone else. Papa was in 8th grade when it happened, in his English class at about 3 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon. At the beginning of class, Papa and his buddy T had been messing around and being loud in the back of the classroom, as 8th grade boys often do. His teacher, Miss M, had enough of their disruptions and made Papa switch seats with another student. He moved into the girl's desk in the front row, and she moved back into his desk in the back of the room. When the school exploded, they were taking a test on the book Ivanhoe. Papa was knocked out for a short time, and when he woke up, he couldn't see anything because the dust was so thick. He looked down and saw that his pencil had blown clear through his hand. When the dust cleared, he saw that the whole back of the room was gone. I won't go into details, but there were bodies, and parts of bodies, everywhere. The students in the front half of the room survived. The students in the back half did not. That included Papa's friend T and the little girl who'd been forced to take Papa's desk because of his misbehavior at the beginning of class. If he hadn't been acting up, he would have been killed and she would have lived. He carried the guilt of her death until the day he died. Papa's classroom was on the 2nd floor. There wasn't any way to get to the room other than the open cavity of the explosion. After the few seconds of initial shock wore off, he and another classmate jumped into action. They were the only 2 kids in the class who hadn't been badly injured. They made a tourniquet out of a sock and a shoelace for a girl with a severe injury to her arm and dug out their teacher, who was alive, but badly injured. By then, men were running up underneath the hole, so Papa and the other boys started lowering the injured to them. Then those who could walk, including Papa, climbed down. He ran off to look for his older brother, capital B, to see if he was okay. As it turned out, B had been supposed to be in geometry class. However, he and his buddy had snuck out to go fishing. The explosion happened as they were opening the door to head out to the parking lot. The force of the blast sent them tumbling head over foot across the lot. They were both banged up and dazed, but they survived. The rest of their geometry class was killed. I don't know that there's a moral in the fact that both my grandfather and his brother survived because they were misbehaving that day. I do know that it weighed very heavily on both of them for the rest of their lives. There's a lot more to his story about the day and the aftermath. Most of it absolutely horrific, but I won't go into all of it here. A few small tidbits though. Papa and the boy who helped him rescue the other students from their classroom were both awarded medals and certificates of valor for their actions that day. Nearly every family in town lost a child, some all of their children. I'm sure you can imagine the extreme toll this took on everyone's mental health. Papa described New London in the months following the explosion as a town with no children. To help with the healing process, the oil companies actively recruited families with kids to transfer in, so that there was some sense of normalcy when school started again in the fall. Papa had played French horn in the school band. However, when school started up again, he was asked to switch to trumpet, as the entire trumpet section had been killed. A few years later, my grandfather went on to fight in World War II, and he saw some of the worst conflicts in the Pacific, including Pelileo and the liberation of Manila. But he said that nothing he saw during the war was ever as bad as what he saw the day of the explosion. I'm always amazed that more people don't know about it. It was major international news at the time. Edit. Holy cow. I'm overwhelmed by the amount of interest this has brought. Thank you for all of the awards and comments. To address a couple of things people mentioned in the comments, there is a small museum at the site of the explosion at New London. If you're ever out that way, I do recommend checking it out. It is very well done and incredibly moving. My grandfather's story, while amazing, is just one of many that day. A couple people mentioned the telegram from Hitler. Yes, it's there at the museum. This was a few years before he came into full power, but he was an up-and-coming political figure in Germany at the time. I looked it up online. The original is in German, but the translation reads, "On the occasion of the terrible explosion at New London, Hex, which took so many young lives, I want to assure your excellency of my and the German people's sincere sympathy. Adolf Hitler, German Reichschancellor." I don't know the details, but I do know from some things my grandmother said, that Papa had some PTSD, both from the explosion and the war. We did get the recordings converted to digital files, which we have stored in several safe locations. A number of years ago I undertook the project of transcribing everything and putting together a book of my grandfather's total memoirs. In addition to the school explosion, he really lived a fascinating life. As a little kid, he was present for one of the most famous circus disasters of all time, the Corsicana Elephant Rampage, and he saw some of the fiercest action in the Pacific as an engineer for the Army Air Force during World War II. He also went from being the dirt poor son of an oil field worker to a pretty successful salesman later in life. At the same time my dad went to graduate school. Papa decided to go back to school and get his master's as well, which led to a career shift to become a college professor, and he taught in both Louisiana and Hong Kong. He was really a very interesting guy. Sadly, he had his 2 strokes when I was pretty young, and he died when I was 14. So all of my memories of him are of a pretty ill man in a wheelchair, working on transcribing his memoirs. I feel like I got to know him better after his death than I ever did in life. I am so thankful for that. I compiled the memoirs into a book that we published just for family members. In addition to my grandfather's personal photographs, he kept a camera with him all throughout the war. There are a number of pictures that I pulled from online, so we couldn't publish it as it is due to copyright issues. but maybe someday I will go back and reformat everything to submit to the Library of Congress or for wider distribution. You want a happy story about him to help counter the explosion? This is a good one. At the start of World War II, while he was in basic training, a girl named Kitty sent her brother Keith a goofy picture of herself splashing around in the creek behind their family farm in TX. The picture of Kitty caught the attention of Keith's bunkmate, Papa, who decided to write Kitty a smart alecky note of his own, jokingly criticizing her manners for showing her ugly bare feet in public. Kitty was not amused. She wrote him a scathing letter and received a very apologetic note from Papa in response. This began a written correspondence that continued throughout the war. Papa wrote faithfully from some of the most remote, dangerous locations in the Pacific. She sent him news of the home front and taunted him with descriptions of fried chicken dinners. He sent her pictures of crocodiles and told her of the orphan children he cared for after the liberation of Manila. When Papa came back to the US in 1946, he made a trip out to the farm to see his old friend Keith and to finally meet Kitty face to face. That was on a Friday. They were engaged the following Wednesday and were happily married for over 50 years. Edit number 2 for a typo. Edit number 3 the essayist brought this video clip to my attention, and it's a pretty good account of the event. There are first-hand survivor stories, including one quite similar to my grandfather's situation. Only this man traded seats with another student so that he could sit near the girl he liked. He survived. The other student did not. Worth a watch, but be warned that it's pretty heartbreaking. The Children's Blizzard. It occurred in January 1888 on an unseasonably warm day. The weather was nice and many school kids were tricked into not wearing coats or jackets to school, some only in short sleeves. While the kids were in class, the weather outside changed dramatically from warm and sunny at noon to dark and heavy like a thunderstorm, with heavy winds and visibility at 3 steps by 3 p.m. Children left school to go home and do their chores. This was in Minnesota, and were expected to milk the cows and do whatever else was involved in the family farm. But they got lost in the darkness and snow and the wind and many froze to death in their town, just yards from houses or other sources of refuge. 235 people, mostly children, died. There is a novel about the blizzard out now, and there is a non-fiction book about the event as well. I think they have the same title. Different authors. The Children's Blizzard, non-fiction by David Laskin. The Children's Blizzard, fiction by Melanie Benjamin. The Massacre of Kalavrita. It is a village in Greece. The Germans entered it and rounded up all the male villagers in a field. They then shot them all with machine guns. After that they got the children and women and put them in the church. When everyone was inside, they locked the doors and set fire to the church. Around 20 minutes into the burning, a German soldier couldn't take it anymore and opened the doors. Around half of the people escaped the fire but the rest perished. The German soldier was shot for this, and if you go to Kalavrita today his name is on the memorial. No one was punished for this apart from the leader of the division, who I was told by my grandmother that he died in a gulag, but everyone else got away with it. It is sad that no one knows about this, as things like this happened all over Greece and Russia and Poland. I only know about this because my great-grandmother was one who escaped in the church. This massacre was in retaliation for the villagers supporting the local resistance force, which had recently killed about 10 Nazis. Human experimentation by Japanese Unit 731 during World War II, committed primarily against innocent Chinese civilians. Nothing I've ever heard of in my life, including in fiction, is darker than the horrors committed for years by Unit 731, a military biological and chemical weapons research division of the Japanese Imperial Military. There's not enough room in a Reddit post to list half of it, but here's a taste. Dissections of living babies, pregnant women, etc. without anesthesia, also known as a vivisection, usually after they had been deliberately exposed and left to suffer from horrible diseases, chemical and biological weapons, and so on. Freezing limbs off of victims. Horror movie sadistic surgeries involving cutting off limbs and attaching them to the wrong sides of the victim, or removing organs and connecting the tubes back together without the organs to see what would happen, such as running the esophagus straight to the intestines with no stomach in between. Not to mention the fact that the victims were routinely raped and tortured for the sake of abuse and torture, without even the flimsy excuse of science being conducted. And we're talking about thousands upon thousands of victims, usually hapless Chinese civilians, political prisoners, POWs, and the homeless, over the course of years in huge facilities with thousands of staff committing these atrocities. The icing on the cake? General MacArthur and the rest of the US government found out about it when they captured Japan also, and they granted Unit 731 immunity for their war crimes so long as they share their findings with America and only America. Many of the former Unit 731 members even went on to have very successful and profitable futures in Japan after the war. Edit. Based on a couple of the comments I've gotten where people are making judgment calls about the modern day Japanese for this, I'd just like to make clear that I hold no prejudice against the Japanese, and I'm certainly not encouraging others to. Also, every country and people has truly horrific pasts, and almost all of them sweep it under the rug as best they can. Even in our generation, we can argue that torture conducted by US soldiers in Guantanamo or Abu Ghraib, for example, aren't half as bad, or were more justified. But ultimately torture is torture and sadism is sadism. A culture or government that begins to permit such things and justify them is well on its way down the spiral with enough motivation. Let's not fool ourselves into comforting racism or nationalism that our countries or people are incapable of atrocities of our own, even today. The January 1945 sinking of the MV Wilhelm Gustloff. It was a German ship carrying fleeing Germans from the Eastern Front to the west through the Baltic Sea. It was sunk by the Soviet Navy shortly after setting sail. The total death toll is unknown but estimated at over 9,000 since there were so many stowaways. It is the worst maritime disaster ever, several times more than the Titanic. It didn't get nearly the press because they were the enemy, so who cares? And the Nazi media certainly didn't report it because they're at the waning days of a war they're badly losing, so the last thing they need is more hits to their already sinking morale. The sad case of Ota Benga. He was a pygmy boy from the Congo who was essentially captured and brought to the USA to be displayed in freak shows. He had undergone tribal customs such as having his teeth filed into points before his capture. He eventually got out of the carnivals and dreamed of returning to Africa. Then World War I happened, making the trip impossible for the foreseeable future. He committed suicide by gunshot. The death of Roger Williamson. At the 1973 Dutch Grand Prix, in the 1970s era of Formula 1, the cars weren't far off from being an overpriced metal coffin on wheels, surrounded by highly flammable fuel, and during the Dutch Grand Prix, this became painfully obvious indeed. Roger Williamson crashed out after a tire puncture, and his car came to rest upside down, with him trapped inside. He was not seriously hurt by the crash, but then the fuel tank ignited and the car burst into flames. Another driver named David Purley was behind Williamson when the crash occurred, and he saw the whole crash unfold. Purley stopped his car on the other side of the track, ran across an active racetrack, and proceeded to try and save Williamson's life. This is where the dark part of it comes in, and depending on your sensibilities, downright outrageous and disgraceful. None of the trackside marshals had any fireproof equipment, which prevented any of them from helping Purley to right the burning car. They also had a grand total of one fire extinguisher between them, which was incapable of putting out the flames. Additionally, not a single other driver who saw the calamity stopped to help, despite Purley's frantic waving to them, to try and get anyone to assist in saving Williamson's life. Meanwhile, race control decided not to hold the race despite a flaming wreck being present on track, and it took almost 10 minutes before the fire engine arrived on site, by which point, Williamson had asphyxiated from the smoke and flames. As soon as the fire was out, they simply put a blanket over the burned out car and continued racing. Later on, other drivers and the race controllers would claim that they assumed Williamson's car was actually Purley's, and that there was no one at risk at that time, something that the many hundreds of people within the grandstands would strongly disagree with. Williamson burned to death right in front of a grandstand packed with spectators, who all got a front row seat to watching Williamson die before their very eyes. So there you have it, a young, promising driver slowly being burnt alive over the course of 10 minutes, A second driver desperately trying in vain to save his life. A group of marshals woefully under-equipped for the job. Indifferent drivers, incompetent race control, and a disaster which shook Formula 1 to its core. As a result of this debacle, changes were made to try and avoid this type of event occurring again in the future. The biggest change was the mandate that marshals should wear fireproof clothing. And it was also noted that drivers were more willing to stop at accident sites to assist in rescuing fellow drivers. This was most clearly seen during the 1976 German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring Nordschleife, where Guy Edwards, Harold Ertl, Brett Lunger and Arturo Merzario all pulled over to assist in getting Niki Lauda out of his burning Ferrari, after the infamous crash that took him out of the German, Austrian and Dutch Grand Prix. The Cambodian genocide. You could have been killed just for wearing glasses, therefore being an intellectual. At least this was the Khmer Rouge logic. The prisoners were tortured so badly that they tried to commit suicide in every possible way, even by using some spoons. The executions used to be like this. The prisoners were put on a straight line and to the second prisoner was given an object like a shovel or a hammer which he had to use to kill the prisoner in front of him. Then, the same object was given to the third prisoners and the cycle would repeat until there was nobody alive except for the last prisoner on the line, who was then killed by the guards. Since many medics were killed or sent to work as farmers, the local regime used child medics to conduct experiments on the prisoners. They used teenagers with no knowledge of Western medicine to experiment on people without anesthesia. For example, they opened one person's chest just to see his heart beating. Imho. This it is even worse than Unit 731. The Vipeholm experiment. Sweden are mostly known as a not very scary country, with good and mostly accessible dental care. Well, part of how that came to be is this. Hey, you are institutionalized and suffering and powerless. Let's make your teeth rot out of your skull. For our science. The Radium Girls. In the 1920s, they worked at a watch company painting the hours on the watches using radium, a radioactive element that glows in the dark. They did this with no PPE and weren't told radium is dangerous. Meanwhile, the chemists had full PPE and worked in a sealed environment. Worse, they were instructed to lick the tip of the brush to make a very fine point. Some of them would paint their nails or their teeth with it for fun when they went out at night. They would develop cancer whenever the paint touched, and many of them had such decay in their jaws that their mandibles had to be held on with bandages. Edit. Apparently there's a new movie about this, as many redditors have helpfully pointed out. None of my American history classes in high school taught the 1921 Tulsa massacre. I legit didn't know about it until I saw a comment on Reddit. Link, for those curious. The ideal maternity home here in Canada. From the 1920s till the 1940s. They took in babies from unwed mothers and they were selling them especially to desperate Jewish families in New Jersey. Adoption was illegal in the US back then. It was later discovered that the people who ran this business would starve the unmarketable babies by feeding them only molasses and water. The babies would last around 2 weeks on this diet. They put the corpses in wooden boxes often used for butter, and that's why the victims are called the butter box babies. The boxes were either buried on the property or at sea or burned in the home furnace. The parents who gave their child to this maternity home would go back and see how their child is doing, but were told the child has died when in fact it had been sold to adopting parents. Between 400 and 600 died in that home and at least 1,000 were adopted, but sadly, the adopted babies often suffered from diseases because of the unsanitary conditions and lack of care at the home. You know Jameson whiskey? Well, a long ass time ago in like the 19th, one of their family heirs fed a little girl to cannibals. Like legit went and bought a little girl in the Congo as a slave and brought her up to a cannibal tribe because he wanted to see them. Sick duck drew pictures of it and it as it was happening. Of course, for years the family tried to bury the fact, and the stories and such, discredit the witnesses. But the crazy bastard was happy to document the whole thing. His only rebuttal in case it reflected badly on him was that he wanted to see if they would do it, and his accounts matched up with the evidence witnesses had provided. Edit. Really lads? 2 wholesome awards? You didn't think a cute puppy or kitten deserved those accolades more? The hell is wrong with you people? If you're interested in more morbid historical anecdotes and facts, I highly recommend the Gritty Past for that type of content. One that really stands out to me from the subbies, this image of the Filipino zoo girl that was on display in the Coney Island Zoo in 1914. She was bound by ropes and people tossed peanuts at her. It's just heartbreaking to see something like that happen, especially to a child so young. Many people have no idea that human zoos existed, but they are definitely a dark part of history. What's crazy is that there have still been some that have popped up in the 21st century, although not as cruel as they used to be. Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VI, father of Henry VIE. She was married off at age 12 to Edmund, 25, who was desperate to get her pregnant as quickly as he could. It was not unusual for members of the aristocracy to marry young. It was slightly more unusual, because of the risk to both mother and child, for them to get pregnant before the age of 14. Edmund died of plague while Margaret was pregnant. She was widowed and alone and pregnant during war. The birth was a very difficult one and would scar her forever. For a time they believed that she and her unborn child would perish. Not only was she very young, but she was also slight of stature and undeveloped for her age, so it's a wonder she even survived childbirth. It was so difficult for her that she never became pregnant again over the rest of her years. Despite remarrying 2 more times, it is widely believed that she was physically damaged during the childbirth and was unable to conceive again. But it's also possible she was too traumatized to ever put herself in that situation again. Either way, Margaret devoted herself to her son, calling him my dearest and only desired joy in this world. Once in the 70s, a film crew was filming an episode of The $6 Million Man, and they were shooting at an amusement park funhouse kind of thing. A stagehand was moving what he thought was a prop wax figure on a noose, only for one arm to fall off, revealing human flesh and bone underneath. After an autopsy, it was revealed to be the 60-something-year-old corpse of an old Wild West outlaw that had been taxidermied to an extent. Edit. Thanks for the award. A lot of Salmonella fans. Ha. In the early 80s, Bayer knowingly sold millions of dollars worth of HIV and hepatitis tainted medications to Asia and Latin America. These countries didn't have laws to prevent the proliferation of tainted drugs. Thousands of people died as a result. It was hardly mentioned on any news platforms. Highland clearances. Thousands of Scots were forcibly evicted from their homes. Many were forcibly exported to Canada, the US or Australia. Many who refused were massacred with whole villages of women and children raped. Many died of starvation on the forced marches or from famine. Also they could farm sheep. Duck Patrick Sellers. Mother and baby homes here in Ireland. Most Irish people will know about this, but most people from other countries don't. Basically, mother and baby homes, or laundries, were places run by nuns where women would be sent if they got pregnant before marriage, and would do all the laundry from people who sent their dirty clothes to the homes until they gave birth. During childbirth they would be provided with no real medical procedure, anesthesia etc., and the nuns would often verbally abuse them during the process for being so sinful as to have sex before marriage. When the baby was born, the umbilical cord was cut and that was the last contact the mother would have with the baby, ever. The nuns would only ever rarely let the baby live, and if they did it would be abused by the nuns its whole childhood for being the product of sin. But most of the babies didn't survive, and you would think, maybe, they would be killed humanely. Nope. Dropped into a septic tank. They've all been shut down now obviously, but they ran until the late 70s I believe. During excavations they would find the remains of around 300 newborn babies for each home. I apologize if any of this is a little inaccurate. I will gladly correct myself if I've gotten something wrong. There's a surprising amount of people that don't know about the Rwanda genocide that happened pretty recently, like when Bill Clinton was president. Basically there were 2 types of Rwanda natives, the Hutus and Tutsis. The Hutus believed the Tutsis were invaders of land that was theirs, and after the assassination of the Rwandan leader, who was a Hutu, the Hutus were ordered to chop down the tall trees, which meant kill the Tutsis. The differences between Hutus and Tutsis were that Hutus were supposedly darker skinned, shorter in stature, and had shorter faces. That's why the Tutsis were called tall trees. The events that followed killed so many Tutsis, yet the UN was stingy to call it a genocide. They never like using that term because of its association with World War II and the Nazis. It wasn't until very recently that the killing stopped. To this day, Hutus and Tutsis that survived the genocide speak at events side by side speaking about how terrible the events were. Magdalene asylums, also known as Magdalene laundries, places of reform for women that didn't fit the idea of a good upstanding citizen. The most well-known ones were in Ireland. The women and girls were abused and mistreated by asylum staff, most of whom were nuns. Here's the Wikipedia article. More sources at the bottom of the page. Eater. Thank you to everyone adding on with more horror stories about this place. Mass graves. Selling these women's children to people in other countries. Blocking any parental rights. There's apparently at least one movie coming out. A lot of stories about it. And so many people sharing stories from their mothers and grandmothers. I guess it's more well known than I first thought. Anyone who's familiar with Mary, Queen of Scots, most likely knows that she was beheaded. But many people don't know how she was beheaded. My APUSH teacher told my class this story, and it's probably one of the most simultaneously interesting, funniest, and saddest executions in history. The first thing to note was that Mary wore a red dress rather than a white one for a very specific reason. After the execution of a royal or high-class person, commoners would often tear off blood-stained fabric from their clothing solely to flex that they got their hands on the blood of a noble. With red fabric, it would be difficult to see actual blood on the dress. Smart move on Mary's end. During the actual execution, it was said that Mary's executioner was not very experienced and actually missed the initial swing, jamming the axe or whatever weapon they used into the back of her head rather than through her neck. This didn't kill her yet, though, and she instead made some sort of medieval olden time exclamation that can be roughly translated to goddamn. Edit. After the executioner was done, he picked up her head by the hair, not knowing it was a wig, and the head fell out and rolled onto the floor. Thanks Plug 5 and Mochi for reminding me. After Mary was properly killed, her body was left for public viewing, but the audience was surprised to see her red dress start to rustle before allowing Mary's small terrier dog to climb out from underneath. Tragically, the dog refused to leave the body and eventually passed away after staying at the same spot for a lengthy amount of time. History buffs, please feel free to make any corrections, as I heard this story a while ago and probably made a few errors in my recalling. TL.Dr. Mary, Queen of Scots, avoided crazy memorabilia savers at her execution with a very intelligent move. Got shanked in the head during a failed attempt. The executioner dropped her head onto the floor and had her dog in her dress with her the entire time. The abuse of Nanking. Some of the things I have read have made me physically sick. Croatia's Ustachus. Sick radical Methodicas. An Ustacha that isn't able to take out a baby from its mother's womb with a blade isn't a good Ustacha. Anti-Pavelic. Some of their most horrific crimes were burning babies in front of their parents, mangling kids from 0-14 with axes, raping girls in front of their mothers, cutting off the ears and noses of their prisoners while being alive. Even the Nazis were horrified by these guys' methods. During Prohibition, the government funded and led an operation to release barrels of alcohol that they had poisoned to make people sick and shy away from bootleg liquor. Lots of people ended up dying, but people still drank more than ever. Not many people outside of Canada know about the abusive residential schools many indigenous kids were forced to go to up until the 90s. But even less know that many were also experimented on in the quest to cure tuberculosis. Truly sick stuff. Use of the Judas cradle for torture. The Judas cradle was a pyramid-shaped seat set up high where the victim would be seated on the pinnacle, while tied. The pyramid point would penetrate the victim's anus or V, and the sheer weight and movement of the person would slowly help it penetrate more. The torturer would sometimes add weight to the victim's legs, rock them, or add oil to the pyramid to increase the pain and quicken death. Have you heard of Terror? He was born with a stupidly rare eating disorder and basically ate everything he found get his hands on, including a cadaver, and finally hit rock bottom when he ate a baby whole. Madame Lowari, slave owner who tortured her slaves in horrifying ways. Evil It. The Korean comfort women under Imperial Japanese rule. World War II. The Japanese were as inhumane as the Nazis were, if not worse, yet all is forgiven by 2 nuclear bombs. So it seems. The Japanese government still has not confirmed that these atrocities happened. Child marriage in America isn't talked about as much as it should be. What's worse is that it's still a thing. In the 1920s, the Osage Indians, Oklahoma, USA, discovered one of the largest oil fields on Earth. They went from being poor to being the richest civilization on Earth overnight. Imagine Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and Elon Musk living on the same street. The Osage were building mansions, hiring servants, driving exotic cars, and the women were marrying white men as trophy husbands. It wasn't long before people started moving into town and exploiting them. Slowly, one by one, they began being murdered. By the end, hundreds had died. The men were hiring people to kill their wives. Lawyers were drawing contracts to transfer oil rights and tricking the Osage into signing them. It was so crazy that it led to the birth of the FBI. This was one of their original investigations, and is still largely unsolved. Martin Scorsese is currently directing a movie about it. It's going to be based on the book Killers of the Flower Moon, which is where I learned about it. Super interesting read.